You know how every so often in life you'll be considering, say, taking a job somewhere or doing business with a certain company, but there's something about the place that doesn't feel quite right, so you say, I know, I'll go have a look at their website. And then you go to the website, and there's a really fancy looking homepage, there's lots of links and directories and everything, but when you start clicking on things, the next page has got like one thing on it, two things on it, no things on it, and you quickly deduce, okay, this isn't a real website, is it? This is something that somebody spent part of an afternoon on, maybe 4 or 5 years ago, and they haven't touched it since then. So the chances are pretty good that I am dealing with some sort of shady fly-by-night operation here. What's that? Oh, why yes, Jim Eagle, I actually was just about to mention the Penn's Biden Center for Plausible Deniability and Great Honking Bags of Chinese Cash. How did you guess? So yeah, let's just say, if you were running a thinly veiled money laundering scheme under the rubric of a major American university and you wanted to make a website so as to imbue it with some slight veneer of respectability, but you wanted to pay your web designer just as little as possible, it would look exactly like the actual website for the Penn Biden Center. In fact, I think the biggest piece of content on the website is the mission statement, which I shall read out presently, because it is a great object lesson in how you can say lots of really fancy sounding words without expressing any coherent thoughts whatsoever. And if anybody's an expert in not expressing coherent thoughts, it is President, semi-animated cadaver, and noted Corvette enthusiast Joseph R. Biden Jr. Begin quote. The Penn Biden Center for Diplomacy and Global Engagement at the University of Pennsylvania is founded on the principle that a democratic, open, secure, tolerant, and interconnected world benefits all Americans. Based in our nation's capital, the Penn Biden Center engages more of our fellow citizens in shaping this world while ensuring the gains of global engagement are widely shared. U.S. leadership has sustained an open world for more than 70 years, enabling virtually every advantage we enjoy as Americans and helping to ensure our safety, our prosperity, and our way of life. Comprised of common norms, rules, and institutions, the American-led liberal international order has facilitated the free movement of people, goods, ideas, and capital, protected the sovereignty and self-determination of nations, and promoted basic human rights and fundamental freedoms for all peoples. Today, this order is under threat. It is being challenged by authoritarians and extremists and strained by the pace, scope, and disruptive nature of global change. It is in our interest as Americans to defend the liberal international order, even as we work to improve it, to better reflect the times in which we live and address the new challenges we face. The Penn Biden Center engages Penn students and partners with its faculty and global centers to convene world leaders, develop and advance smart policy, and strengthen the national debate for continued American global leadership in the 21st century. Throughout his decades of public service, the center's namesake, Joseph R. Biden Jr., has fought to secure American global leadership by defending and advancing a liberal international order. The center will bring President Biden's lifelong commitment to public service to its every endeavor, close quote. So there you go. I hope that very specific and vivid description has dispelled any and all doubts you may have had about the many perfectly legitimate and upstanding activities of the Penn Biden Center for Awkward Groping and Briefcases Full of Money. Maybe you'll think next time before being taken in by any crazy right-wing misinformation. From high atop the battlements of Castle Curmudgeon, where hospitality is our middle name and my chamber pot is your chamber pot, good evening, Mr. and Mrs. America and all ships at sea. Welcome to the program. I am your eponymous host and humble servant. And speaking of ships at sea, if you're a fan of military humor, then you know the history of the Russian Navy often reads a lot like a Mel Brooks movie, playing out in real life. And you also know it's perfectly fitting that the unofficial motto of the Russian Naval Service is, and then it got worse. Now, as you know, there are lots of people in our political and media plutocrat classes who are very deeply desirous that the United States go to war with Russia. And it starts in the White House, obviously, with a president who spent literally all of December 2021 and January 2022 practically begging Vladimir Putin to move against Ukraine, which he, of course, did at the beginning of February, coming up on 1 year ago. And there are plenty of other people in the government, in the executive branch, in the administrative state, in the national security state, in the Congress, Democrats and Republicans alike, who are each in thrall in their own particular way to some aspect of the military-industrial complex, and they know that war with Russia would be good for their personal bottom line. And if they can't get an official hot shooting war, then they will settle for fighting an open-ended blank check proxy war against Russia through Ukraine. The cheerleaders for this war, they'll tell you, with a straight face even, that we have to oppose Putin in Ukraine because if we don't, then those marauding Russian hordes will march all across Europe, subjugate the entire continent, and it's only a matter of time before they invade America, and our last hope for survival is a plucky group of teenage insurgents in rural Colorado led by Patrick Swayze and Charlie Sheen. Oh wait, that's Red Dawn. Never mind. The point being, there are lots of people, liars I believe they're called, who want you to believe the United States versus Russia is a more or less even match in military terms. And never mind the fact that they're currently bogged down in a year-long quagmire, unable to even subdue their much smaller, much weaker next-door neighbor country. You just need to stop believing your lying eyes, they tell you. Because that's exactly what Putin wants you to think. Russia is actually a first-rate major world power, and it's to our own peril that we ever start thinking otherwise. Meanwhile, we're going to need another, $45 billion to send to Ukraine. Now just stop asking any questions about where the money winds up. Just sign the damn check like a good patriot, and we can be finished here. But here's the thing about being a first-rate world power. In order to be one of those, you need to possess the ability to project military power to any location on the Earth's surface. And you know how you do that? You do it with capital ships. And capital ships happen to be a good shorthand, a consistently reliable metric for measuring a country's relative military strength. You can go all the way back to any point in the last 500 years or more, and the countries that could field the most capital ships were the most powerful countries. Half a millennium ago, galleons were the capital ships. Then it was first-rate ships to the line. Then it was ironclads. Then it was pre-dreadnought battleships. Then it was dreadnought battleships. Right up until 7 December 1941, when everybody suddenly realized that aircraft carriers were now the capital ships, which they, of course, still remain right up to the present day. And yes, I know Russia has ballistic missile submarines. Yes, I know Russia has a theoretically very large stockpile of nuclear warheads. But here's the thing about submarines and warheads. They don't do you any damn good unless you are actually in a nuclear war. And you cannot project power to the opposite side of the globe with any damn ballistic missile sub in the same way that you can with a carrier fleet task group. First of all, because you can't publicly announce where your submarines are, since that kind of defeats the whole purpose of having them. And second of all, because you can have all the nuclear missile subs in the world and they're all equally useless as long as you're in a conventional war. When you're some misbehaving foreign despot and the President of the United States wants to get your attention, what does he do? He sends a Nimitz-class aircraft carrier, 4 cruisers, and 10 destroyers, and before he knows it, that foreign despot has got F-18s buzzing his command center 6 times per day, implicitly encouraging him to pursue a diplomatic solution. The U.S. Navy currently operates 10 Nimitz-class fleet carriers and 1 Gerald R. Ford class, with 4 more of the Ford class currently in construction. Each one of those vessels has on the order of a 100,000-ton displacement. Russia has 1 aircraft carrier, the Admiral Kuznetsov, which displaces 54,000 tons. In other words, Russia's best and only carrier is roughly half the size of the carriers, about the same size as our World War II carriers, and half the size of the ones we currently operate, of which we have 12. Now, if you're talking about flight deck area, the current U.S. carrier fleet is bigger than all other carriers in all other countries combined. Oh, and the Admiral Kuznetsov hasn't operated under her own power since 2018. She was supposed to go in for an overhaul and modernization. They placed her in a super advanced floating dry dock to perform the work in, and then the floating dry dock promptly sank with the result that one of the cranes punched a 100-foot square hole right in the middle of her flight deck. And then it got worse. See, they were using this floating dry dock because there wasn't any actual traditional dry dock in all of Russia that could accommodate a vessel of this size. So what the hell do we do now? Drink vodka? Play chess? Chase moose and squirrel? No, says the Russian Navy. We will simply take our 2 biggest dry docks in Murmansk and we'll turn them into one super duper big dry dock. Problem solved. Except, that's going to take at least another year and a half. And then it got worse. In December of 2019, as work was underway fixing the giant-ass crane-shaped hole in the flight deck, some joker decided it would be fun to set the ship on fire. By the time they got it extinguished, there was $8 billion in damage to the vessel, 2 deaths, a dozen injuries, in addition to the 1 death and 10 injuries from the dry dock sinking incident, in addition to 2 other deaths that happened during the expansion of the dry dock in Murmansk. So, as things stand today, the official position of the Russian Admiralty is that if everything goes exactly according to plan from here on out, there is an outside chance that Admiral Kuznetsov might potentially return to service sometime in 2024. Oh, and I guess I would be remiss in not mentioning that even in the best of times, the Admiral Kuznetsov's career has been a bit of a grand embarrassment when you get right down to it. She has a tendency to belch thick black smoke out of her funnel. And it's happened more than once that during a big public fleet review, her engine simply stopped working, and she had to be towed past the reviewing stand by a couple of tugboats, because that's not very embarrassing. So what's the moral of this story? First, the Russians are not a seafaring people, and it is their destiny to never have an effective blue water navy. Second, Russia is not a major world power because they lack the ability to project power globally. But they did try. Once. Now, when I talk about the history of the Russian Navy reading like a Mel Brooks movie, it is the Voyage of the 2nd Pacific Squadron in 1905 that best fits this bill. You see, Russia and Japan, they went to war with each other in 1904 over a series of territorial disputes, some of which actually persist to the present day. The biggest one of the casus belli was the fact that Russia controlled Port Arthur on the coast of Manchuria, and Japan, trying to establish itself as a world power and gain a naval installation on the Asian mainland, they said, well, we don't like Russia having Port Arthur. We want Port Arthur for ourselves, so we're damn well going to take it. So they promptly laid siege to the place. Russia didn't have sufficient military resources on site to repel the invaders, so they hunkered down as best they could to resist the siege. And back in St. Petersburg, which is still the capital of Russia at this point, the Tsar decides, well, this aggression will not stand. Port Arthur must be relieved. So he calls up the head of his Baltic fleet and he says, Admiral, I want you to form a detachment of your fleet. I want you to rename it the 2nd Pacific Squadron, and I want you to sail at once to the relief of Port Arthur. But here's the trouble. Not only has Russia never won a battle on the high seas, they haven't even done all that much voyaging on the high seas. And this is a 17,000-mile trip from Königsberg through the North Sea down the Iberian coast all the way around the Horn of Africa. And if all that goes to plan, well, then you're halfway to getting where you're going. You've still got to traverse the whole Indian Ocean, the Philippine Sea, before you start to get reasonably close to your destination where you're supposed to fight the battle. And let's not forget either that this is 1905, the pre-Dreadnought era, so we are still in the age of coal. And for this flotilla to get from its starting point to its destination was going to require fully 500,000 tons of coal. And obviously the Russian Navy doesn't have the logistical capability to provide that refueling support on its own, so they have to rent out a bunch of private foreign vessels, load them up with coal, and pre-position them along the route as floating fuel depots. So this is all a tall task, to be sure, but it still should be achievable, shouldn't it? I mean, as long as you've got good command and control and a motivated, well-disciplined crew, then we should be able to... Oh, come on, who are we kidding? And then it got worse. Now, this voyage is the main part of the reason why those 5 words became the unofficial motto of the Russian Navy, because things did, in fact, get much, much worse. You see, there was a certain vessel in this flotilla, a repair ship by the name of Kamchatka. And to the extent that the excursion of the 2nd Pacific Squadron became the most infamously ill-fated voyage of the damned in world naval history, the Kamchatka and her crew had much to do with it. For throughout the entire 17,000-mile trip, any time another vessel came into their view over the horizon, Kamchatka, she would simply open fire on it in the belief that it was a Japanese torpedo boat. Because, hey, sometimes you're traversing the Straits of Denmark in 1905 and there's a whole fleet of Japanese torpedo boats lying in wait to ambush your ass, right? So that's where we get the snafu that became known to history as the Dogger Bank incident, where the Russians happened upon a few English fishing boats and Kamchatka immediately started firing on them. So then some of the other Russian ships, they also started firing because they wanted to get into the act in the apparent belief that, hey, if Kamchatka thinks she sees Japanese torpedo boats sitting between Denmark and Norway, well, damn it, that's good enough for me. Open fire, boys! A few English fishermen wound up getting killed, and the Russians were lucky to be allowed to go on their way without a declaration of war, really. And then it got worse. You see, the smaller elements of the Russian squadron, your frigates and your destroyers and whatnots, they were small enough to transit the Suez Canal. But the battleships and the cruisers, they had to go the long way around. So it was decided that everybody would rendezvous in Madagascar afterward, and then they would finish the second leg of the voyage. So the big ships arrive in Madagascar 2 weeks after the smaller ships get there, and you can probably guess how the first group had been spending their time on shore, getting drunk, impregnating the locals, collecting wild animals for pets, and contracting basically every sexually transmitted disease ever known to medical science. And then it got worse. A crew member from the first group of ships had died from disease during the 2-week interim, and it was decided to wait and conduct his funeral after the rest of the squadron arrived, along with the admiral. So they do the funeral out at sea, everything's going fine, they commit the body of their shipmate to the deep, and then it's time for every ship to fire a salute as a mark of respect toward the deceased, which every vessel then duly did without incident, except Kamchatka. Somebody on board Kamchatka managed to accidentally load a live shell into the gun for the funeral salute, and when she fired, she scored a direct hit on her own admiral's flagship. And to Kamchatka's credit, for all the hundreds of rounds she expended on this voyage, whether at ephemeral Japanese torpedo boats or English fishing trawlers that she mistook for Japanese torpedo boats, this was the only time that she actually managed to hit something. By the time the 2nd Pacific Squadron completed their voyage, it was pretty improbable that they even still had all their ships afloat, but it had taken them fully 7 months to make the trip, and by the time they arrived, Port Arthur had already fallen, and their whole original mission was pointless now. They wound up getting ambushed and utterly annihilated by the Japanese fleet in the action that became known to history as the Battle of Tsushima, which is probably the most lopsided defeat in any battle between forces that theoretically are a more or less even match for each other in terms of displacement and firepower. In terms of casualties, the Russians lost 4,600 men killed to 117 for Japan. The Russians had all but 3 of their ships sunk, including poor old Kamchatka, which went down with all hands, while none of the Japanese ships sustained any meaningful damage. And you know who was paying attention to all this stuff the whole time? President Theodore Roosevelt, that's who. Now, everybody knows he won the Nobel Peace Prize for negotiating the treaty that ended the Russo-Japanese War, but few people realize or appreciate the effect that his experience in that war had on U.S. naval doctrine. Theodore Roosevelt was nothing if not a visionary, and he could see that in the future, countries that want to wield power globally are going to need to be able to send their naval forces anywhere and have them be in fighting shape when they get there. So it's only less than 2 years after Tsushima that you get the Voyage of the Great White Fleet, where Roosevelt went to the Navy and gave them a simple assignment. I want to send a battle fleet all the way around the world, and I want all the resupplying to be done either from a U.S. ship or at a U.S. installation. It wasn't thought at that time that anybody but the Royal Navy had the capacity to pull off such a thing. To the extent that we had overseas installation at that time, we had only just gained them a few years earlier with our defeat of Spain. But that voyage, a round-the-world cruise made during peacetime with no shots fired in anger, that's what established the United States fleet as an effective blue water navy, and thus the United States itself as a major world power. That was Roosevelt saying, you know, sometime in the near future, we might have to send a fleet halfway around the world to fight an important battle. So we damn well need to start practicing for such things, or else we might have the same fate as these Russians did. And the Voyage of the Great White Fleet wound up giving us a decades-long head start on all the things that we would need to know and be good at when it came our turn to fight Japan in 1941 to 45. But in the event, the time came when we needed to start being a global blue water navy, and we were ready for it. Because the first President Roosevelt had the vision to provide the second President Roosevelt with the tools he needed to win the damn thing. But Russia? Again, give me a call when they record their first ever naval victory on the high seas, outside of their own territorial waters, and then, only then, I will be willing to reconsider their status as a second-rate regional power, which is what they currently are. Until then, don't bother. Thanks very much for watching. Have a pleasant tomorrow. See you next time. Do not comply. Get off my lawn.